Get ready for what is going to be a pretty controversial episode. The subject of today's episode is really something that is very much debated in the writing and the screenwriting and the filmmaking communities. I'm talking about Save the Cat. Interesting name, right? Save the Cat is kind of a manual or a beat sheet for people who are writing movies, and then it was kind of extended to people who are writing books. And I feel like it's something helpful, but I do think you need to take it with a grain of salt. And as someone who often writes historical fiction, or at least fiction that's steeped in history, I'll do a ton of research and then I'll get pretty confused as to how my actual story might go or how it should go. And that's where Save the Cat comes in for me and saves my tush. So today I'm going to be talking all about Save the Cat, why it's so helpful for me at least, and why I think it can be helpful for you, what it is exactly, but also some of the things that people say are less helpful about it. So I'll be pretty balanced about what it is and how it works, but I think that it's something that might be able to help you, especially if you have writer's block, especially if you're kind of stuck on how to write a compelling story, and especially if you're trying to write fiction that could make a really good screenplay. That's one of the great things that you want to use Save the Cat for. So let's get started. If you're a writer dreaming of becoming a successful author, join me, writing coach Karenna Akavane, on the How to Be an Author podcast, your weekly source for writing information, inspiration, and motivation. Okay, let's talk about Save the Cat a little bit. Save the Cat is the brainchild of a man named Blake Snyder, who passed away in 2009. He was an American screenwriter. He was also an author and educator based in LA. And through his collection of Save the Cat books on story writing and story structure and screenwriting, he became one of the most popular writing teachers, mentors, and thinkers, at least in the film industry. He led a bunch of workshops and seminars for writers, and he made a great living consulting some of Hollywood's most well-known studios. Snyder sold his first screenplay on spec in 1989, and this was a script called Stop or My Mom Will Shoot. There was actually a bidding war for this, and he ended up selling the script for $500,000, which, especially back in 1989, that is a great amount for a spec script being one that's not been ordered by a studio. It's one that he's just writing and then pitching, which many of you wannabe screenwriters are probably in the process of doing. Then Snyder went on to sell 12 more screenplays, and he was named one of the most successful spec screenwriters in Hollywood, including some million-dollar script sales. One of them was a movie called Blank Check. He also wrote Nuclear Family. A lot of these are movies that maybe are not our favorite movies of all time or movies that we've even watched, but you have to say that they were commercially relatively successful, at least for him. So I think that Snyder has something to say. This book, Save the Cat, the last book on screenwriting you'll ever need, was the #1 best-selling screenwriting manuals on Amazon, at least in 2018. It's already on multiple printings, and it explains basically how to expand the hero's journey, which is kind of this monomyth, is kind of that main archetype of storytelling. It tells you how to expand that into screenwriting. And this is where we run into problems, because people say, wow, this is a little bit minute by minute, is broken down into page numbers pretty much. And that can make for some pretty formulaic and boring scripts. And I agree with you, but we have to take this with a grain of salt, but there are some things in this story structure that are incredibly helpful. So I think it's really worth listening to, especially if you're stuck. Even in your book, you're going to want to hear this. So a student of Snyder's, who's also a young adult novelist named Jessica Brody, she took all of Snyder's ideas and translated them into something that would fit fiction. So she wrote the book, Save the Cat Writes a Novel, the last book on novel writing you'll ever need. And she published that in 2018, which was right when Save the Cat screenwriting book was #1 on Amazon. So she probably did quite well with that. And in fact, Snyder didn't really, take advantage of this bestseller status because he was already dead. But that's okay. So if you've ever fantasized about having your book made into a movie, Save the Cat is probably the best tool to get you there. What the hell, by the way, does Save the Cat mean? The basic idea behind the title is cute. It was Save the Cat was a term coined by Snyder. It described that moment when the protagonist shows the audience that they're worth rooting for. Snyder wrote, it's the scene where we first meet the hero, and then you gain this favor from the audience and you get the support for this main character right for the start. And people complained that Snyder was talking about likability and about liking the character. And yeah, you don't need to like the character necessarily, but you do need to relate to them, empathize with them, or at least care about what happens to them. And by the way, you do not have to save a cat in every story. The protagonist can do anything that makes the audience care about them or see that there's somebody who's worth rooting for. So that can be, helping Girl Scouts, or it can be, helping somebody who fell, or it can be saving somebody who had a car accident, whatever that may be. Your hero's doing it, and it's showing that they are somebody that you can root for. You know how when you read a book or you go to a movie and you're like, well, a lot of things happened. There were lots of action sequences, and, if it was a movie, there were lots of special effects, but it's kind of meh. Well, that's because, according to Snyder at least, more time was spent on making the character cool or tough or sexy rather than likable. Snyder actually used Lara Croft Tomb Raider as an example of this, where basically it was just this whole vehicle made to look, Angelina Jolie looked super sexy, and she's not likable at all. Nobody cares what's going to happen to her. In fact, she could drop dead, and we'd probably be okay. They try to raise the stakes, but even that doesn't really kind of save the movie. It's fun to watch, but it ends there. And I would argue that the follow-up movies, the ones that did not have Angelina Jolie in them, were better because we actually get to like or at least empathize with this Lara Croft character before we go to follow her on an adventure and before we decide that she's sexy and cool and tough. The other thing that's really good about Save the Cat is that it places a really big emphasis on the structure of your story. And I think it's important for your story to be pretty structured. I think it's important for your story to have certain plot points. Now, Snyder has these things that he called beats, and we'll talk about what a beat is, but he had these things that were like these non-negotiables that needed to happen. And again, I think you can take this with a grain of salt, but some of these beats are super duper useful, and I'll be talking about them specifically a little bit later on. Now, you might be thinking that if you're working in nonfiction, especially memoir, maybe Save the Cat is not something that you can use. And I beg to differ. I actually think that too many memoirists write a story that's all about them. And it ends up being this thing that no one but their family will ever care about because it's not a good story. There aren't these plot points. There aren't these things where you start to really root for the main character. So Save the Cat could help to distill something that could be too broad into a more limited experience that has broader appeal, because you're taking this life story and making it into a good story, period. So I think that's really important. And as I was saying, this book was criticized for allegedly leading to formulaic screenplays. And while most screenwriting advice that came before it was super conceptual, Save the Cat really was specific. It was like, these beats should happen. They should happen here. And it was called kind of this minute-by-minute guide to writing a good story. The New York Times, for example, really said that it's what made Hollywood films really boring. But then it questioned whether Save the Cat actually caused this trend of boring films or was actually inspired by it. So keep in mind, this is a great jumping off point. You don't need to follow it 100%. Just make sure that you're using it to have this good character arc, and then you can subvert it or expand on some other things as you see fit. For me, as I was saying, I see it as a great way to get unstuck, but I'm not super worried about hitting every single beat at exactly the right point. So I talked about these beats or these plot points. So a story beat is, especially in screenwriting, it's a moment in your screenplay that moves your story along. It's the thing that leaves your audience considering what is going to happen next, or what needs to happen next, or what might happen next. And it adds this feeling of suspense and mystery to the film. Well, the same thing happens in your book, and I call it causality, right? You have these things that happen, and because that thing happened, the next thing is going to need to happen. So I think that story beats are basically the smallest structural or thematic component of your plot. You know how I was talking about a book being divided into acts and acts being composed of scenes? I have a really hard time working with acts. It's just not the way I think. And of course, the 3-act structure, I don't think is realistic. I think that more modern books have more of a 4-act structure, and we can talk about that some other time. But I really like to think of beats instead, is just the way I actually understand it better. So let's jump right into talking about these different beats. The first beat is the opening image. The opening image sets the tone. It kind of shows you this striking and evocative thing. Hopefully it's kind of a hook that's going to get your viewer or your watcher really invested in what's going on. They're really interested, right? So think about what's appropriate to the type of book you're writing. And too many people use this moment as something to have your character waking up from a dream. And that is not a good opening image, nor is it very compelling. And it's not realistic as a hook because it has not much to do with what's coming after that. So think of something that's striking, think of something that's evocative, and that makes the reader wonder what's going to come next. The next beat is theme stated. So Snyder argued that you needed to kind of explicitly state the story's theme early on so that the person knows exactly what the story's about. And in Snyder's opinion, the way of doing this was to state it through maybe a piece of dialogue or an image or somebody else kind of evoking the theme in a scene where your protagonist is present. I think this can be an interesting thing to do, but here's a little caveat for you. I think that when you're actually writing your story or coming up with your outline, you can start thinking about what the theme is, but I often do this theme stated beat when I'm doing rewrites after I've already written my rough draft, because I feel that when you start with a theme, it becomes too heavy-handed and it feels like your story is a little bit too moralistic. So I think that you can definitely skip this theme stated thing until you're doing your edits, and then you can kind of weave the theme back in. The next beat is something called the setup. This is also part of the opening image and theme stated. It's where the plot hasn't started moving yet. So this is kind of the opening situation of your story. This is where you're setting up the setting, you're setting up the characters, you're setting up, kind of what's going on as a baseline situation. In our previous episode, I was talking about the story spine, and this is basically the part in the story spine where we're saying, once upon a time, there was a blah, every day they blah. This is the setup of your story. By the time your readers finished reading this setup situation, they should pretty much know what the story is about and what the tone's going to be, what the world is like, all of that good stuff. And so if you start to subvert that afterwards, they might get a little bit annoyed unless you do it really, really well. Here comes the next beat. The next beat is the catalyst, otherwise known as the inciting incident. This is the moment that something happens that is going to take your protagonist out of their basic baseline world, their routine, and into the adventure of the story. And it's important that the inciting incident is not something that your main character brings upon themselves. It is something that happens to them, whether it's a natural disaster, somebody doing something, somebody announcing something, a letter coming, any of those things can be a catalyst. And I think make the catalyst big and important enough that it actually is going to convince your character to leave their world. Because here's the next beat. The next beat is the debate. Your protagonist is going to have this inciting incident happen. And do you think that they're going to go, well, sure, here we go. I'm going to change my whole life because this one thing happened? No, that's not realistic. There needs to be some kind of a debate where your protagonist thinks, okay, is this really the thing for me? My world's not ideal, but it's, relatively comfortable. I'm used to it. I don't want to destabilize my whole life. Do I really need to do this? And so that's the debate part where it's like, okay, was this catalyst so destabilizing that I really need to embark on the journey, or can I try to decide? And this gives you a lot of insight as to what your protagonist's psychology is, what's important to them, what their priorities are, what their strengths and weaknesses are. Because let's just think that there's a catalyst, right? There's an inciting incident. And in the debate, for example, your character is going, you know what? I don't think I'm strong enough to do this. I don't think I'm physically strong enough. I'm not mentally strong enough. And that's really compelling for the reader because that introduces suspense. Will they or won't they? Well, eventually they're going to have to, because if not, there wouldn't be a story. But I think that this is really, really crucial. And of course, you can decide whether to make the debate long and drawn out or relatively shorter, depending on the internal logic of your particular story and situation. So keep that in mind. Okay, here comes kind of a problematic beat for me. This is the one that I think I mentioned that I tend to skip. I'm going to skip this one, or at least kind of morph this into other ones. This is called Break Into Two. This is the end of Act 1, where the protagonist is getting ready to leave the world behind. It's Frodo leaving the Shire, for example. It's Neo discovering reality in the Matrix. So it's a literal change, often in geography, sometimes, but it's where the adventure begins. But I really think, I don't like to call this Break Into Two. I like to call this the adventure begins. So it's any preparations that your character is going to need to do to start this voyage from before to after, whether it's a geographic change or not. Okay, now we are hitting another beat called B story. You're going to love this if you were like, wait, why are we talking about just one character? I wanted secondary characters. How do I integrate those into this story? Well, this is where this hits, is the B story. This is an interesting beat, actually, because the B story introduces a complementary plot line, often a romantic subplot maybe, or something following a secondary character who is kind of in the protagonist's world in some way. This Act 2 is going to have enough space to introduce this new plot line. And you want to develop your side characters. You need to add depth and interest to them. And I think it's really good that this B story is at this point in the second act instead of in the first act. So if you want to know something kind of interesting, I had my current work in progress out to beta readers, and I had 2 points of view, 2 characters who are related in some way, which I won't reveal, but they are separated by time. And many of my beta readers said, I would prefer to meet the secondary character later because I want to get more invested in the first main character first. And then I went back and I looked at the Save the Cat thing and I go, you know what? They're absolutely right. I did too much introducing of the secondary character too early in the plot for it to work well. So this is an example of how Save the Cat, these beats are actually very well thought out. Okay, our next beat is a fun one. It's called Fun and Games. Okay. Fun and games, spoiler alert, it's often not fun and there often aren't any games. This is funny. This is the part of the movie where the audience gets, all those fun things in the trailer, like all those fun moments. This is where you see your character engaging in the new world that they've decided to enter, right? This is the scene in the horror movie. You're going to get a bunch of scares, right? You're going to get a bunch of dates if it was a rom-com. So this Fun and Games is basically your character engaging with their new world. Here's a fun little hack to consider for the Fun and Games part. Subvert the expectations of your character and of your audience. So if your character was expecting to have an easy time of it and to be comfortable in their new world, show them having difficulties. And if your character was thinking their new world was going to be super challenging and hard to navigate, show them having some wins, show them having some success in some of the things that they do. This is going to be an interesting way of getting your reader to go, that didn't go as I was expecting. But of course, this all leads us to the midpoint. which is kind of that central axis where things start to change. And again, this subverts your story expectations. So if you've got a happy ending story, there should be a sad moment. There should be some difficult stuff. And if it's a tragedy, there should be some happy, easy moments. The stakes are going to get deeper and deeper. And this is where your story starts to get a little bit more serious. This is where the protagonist starts to realize that there's no return to their original world and situation, but they haven't yet learned enough to realize what the truth is of their situation. They're probably still chasing that primary goal that they had, which is actually probably not exactly what they needed. Okay, your next beat is called Bad Guys Close In. Okay, your bad guys don't need to be literal bad guys, right? So your protagonist has been drawn into this world, they're unable to return, and then there are these events that are making their goal seem really hard to attain. This is where you might meet the antagonist or the villain that might be starting to see your protagonist's fatal flaw and taking advantage of it. But it's not literal bad guys, as I was saying. This could be something where, let's say you're writing a rom-com and the couple starts to wonder if really they're actually in love. Or if you're having an adventure movie, the characters are starting to have internal fights where they're like, we're not on the same page, we should go back. This is really the moment where you start to have these doubts and where people are starting to self-destruct or fight with their allies, all that sort of stuff happening. And this all leads to the next beat point, which is all is lost. This is the kind of really horrible, devastating, difficult event that is going to completely ruin your protagonist's day. It's going to knock them on their butt. They're going to have, maybe there's a death that happens. Maybe there's a breakup. Maybe something horrible happens and they start to feel that they are not going to manage to save the world or even themselves. So this is really, really hard. This needs to be really, really emotional because if it's not, the rest of your story is not going to have as much of an impact. Speaking of emotional impact, the next beat is probably the darkest. This is called the dark night of the soul. This is really, really important to any kind of story. This is the darkest moment by far where they start to see the truth. They start to see how they have contributed to making their goal impossibly far out of reach. And it's made their return to where they came from completely impossible. And it's their fault. And everybody's dumped them. And they're alone. And they're feeling bad. And again, the literalness of all of this can be debated and can be tweaked. But the dark night of the soul is crucial because this is the pit that they're going to have to emerge out of in order to start to head into the third act. And this part is called Break Into Three. This is where there's the realization where the protagonist is like, oh, now I see the truth. Maybe I'm going to kind of call up all the strength I have and I'm going to manage to go on. This is something where they have a newfound knowledge, newfound transformation, and this is going to give them that strength and those powers that they absolutely need. Sometimes, and this is kind of an interesting thing, remember that B story that we had in the background? Yeah, you forgot about it, didn't you? Well, that B story might become the key for the protagonist finding the strength and the information and the truth that is going to allow them to break into Act 3. Next beat is the finale. This is firmly part of Act 3, supposedly, but again, I don't really do this in acts, but that doesn't matter. But this is where your protagonist feels so much stronger because they've got this new knowledge, this new transformation, these new powers, and this is where they're going to feel that they're ready to head into that final confrontation with the antagonistic force, whether it's a villain or whether it's a government or whether it's, an army, whatever it is. This is going to allow them to try to beat them in this confrontation that's going to be super suspenseful and super climactic, whether it's an actual fight or whether it's just an emotional battle. And then you have the last beat, which is the closing image. And that's the final image, which in your story spine would be the ever since then. And that's the happily ever after, or at least the satisfying ending. This is the thing where your reader goes, wow, okay, this ended maybe not the way I expected, but it ended in a way that's satisfying when it comes to the story arc and the development and change in the main character and all of that. And this is also the part where you can probably have that theme come through, and it ends with this closure where the theme is expressed even more. But you don't really need to do that, but that's just something that you can do if it's important to you to have a theme winding all the way through. So here's my takeaway from Save the Cat. I think that notice how the character arc is usually one character and then there's kind of this secondary character, because honestly, too many damn characters, that is a huge mistake. The other thing to take away from it is note how the characters have to act decisively, even if it's on things that they would rather not need to do, and also see how they're undergoing this forced but definite evolution through the challenges and through this emotional pain. So there are people who hate Save the Cat, as I said. They talked about, why does the protagonist have to be likable? There are a ton of stories that have unlikable characters or morally gray characters or anti-heroes. That's fine. Just remember that the main goal is to get your reader to empathize with your character. I can never say empathize. Empathize with your character, and it's not a requirement for them to do this amazing thing to accomplish that, but just think of the different ways that you can have your character be exposed to your audience so that the audience or the reader decides this is a character worth rooting for. Now, again, that act structure, the break into 2, break into 3. Personally, again, as I said, I think modern stories have more of a 4-act structure, but this concept of acts has always been super confusing to me, even as a writing coach. So I have to say, this is one example of a part that I ignore just a little bit in Save the Cat. I just make sure that there's this great transition where the character, kind of goes from one state to another, but that's it. And also, of course, the people say that Save the Cat leads to predictable stories. And that's why you feel free to subvert it, reorder it, mix it up. Just know, though, that if you don't hit some of these beats, especially the more important ones, your book might be less commercially successful, because as much as critics complain about predictability, readers and viewers eat this stuff up. So are you looking to write an artsy book, or one that's popular, one that's going to be made into a movie, one that's going to be made into a TV show? Is really up to you. So you get to decide that. I'm not going to tell you one way or the other. I think it really does help you, though, to get into this mindset of writing for an audience, writing commercial work, and seeing what is commercial, what's not. This form of story, no matter what, it works, and you can decide whether to take or leave all of the advice. So speaking about what readers enjoy, that's actually what we're going to be talking about next time. We're going to be talking about what writers and agents are looking for, so that you don't get too far into this process with a book that's not going to play out the way you had hoped. I think that's going to be a really useful discussion next time on the How to Be an Author podcast. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion of Save the Cat. If you have anything to say about it, please feel free to comment or email me, reach out to me in some way. I would love to hear what you have to say about all of this. I will see you next time. If you have any pressing writing-related questions or would like to be featured on the How to Be an Author podcast, please feel free to reach out on my website, creativeandwritingcoach.com.